So welcome everyone to this week's Torah Portion, and this week is called Vayeshev, and it stands for He Continued Living. The Torah Portion is in Genesis 37 verse 1 to 40 verse 23. The half Torah portion is Amos 26 verse 6 to 3 verse 8. And then the New Testament portion that fits with this is Acts 7 verse 9 to 16. And today we're going to do a discussion. So I'm very excited. Natania's joining me. We're going to try and keep it brief, but deep as well. So we're going to try not to make it too long. So let's start firstly with this portion. And you know what's so amazing, and I'm sure Natania can agree to this as well, when you start studying the Word of God, from the very first word in the Bible, we've got Messiah. So if you look for Messiah, you can find him in every word, in every passage, and in every story. And when we start the story about Joseph, I always get very excited. And I wish that they gave us more time, like that they didn't put so many chapters into one Torah portion, because Joseph is such an amazing character. And Joseph's life most represents the Messiah. Grant Luton does an amazing podcast where he shows you, I think there's over 100 similarities between Joseph and Messiah. And it's just mind-blowing. So we need to be excited when we get to Joseph's life, and we need to stop here and spend some time here, because we can find Messiah in everything. And in this week's Torah portion, we find two references to both times that Messiah comes. We've got two references to Messiah ben Joseph, or Messiah the son of Joseph, and two references to Messiah ben David, or Messiah the son of David. Now, we know that the Jews believe that when they look at prophecy, they think there are two Messiahs that are coming. There's the suffering servant and there's the conquering king. But we know that it's one Messiah, and that he's just coming two times. And each time that he comes, he's got a very specific goal. He's got something that he needs to do every time that he comes. And so he came the first time as the suffering servant, but he's coming again as the conquering king. So let's look at the two references in this week's Torah portion of the two comings of Messiah. The first one is the two dreams that Joseph had. And the rabbis explain it so beautifully, where they speak about the field and the wheat that's bundled together, and what all of that represents. But we know as well that there's a messianic undertone to this. If you look at Joseph's dream, it says that his portion of wheat was bent down and all the others was upright, and then his portion lifted up, raised itself up, and then the rest bowed before him. And that's a picture of resurrection. So that's the Messiah that was dead, that's resurrected, and with his resurrection, there's an acknowledgement of this is the Messiah. And then everyone else, all the brothers, all of us need to bow down and worship him. So that's one of the places where Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering servant, because that's very earthly and humble, the wheat. But then Joseph's second dream about the sun, the moon, and the stars, that's very lofty, that's very elevated. That speaks about Messiah ben David, the second coming of Messiah, where even the heavenly bodies, all of creation, not just man, will bow down and declare that he is the living king, he is the Messiah. So we've got those two references. Then we also have the twins born by Tamar. And we're going to talk about that little passage in Genesis 38 a little bit later in this discussion. But these twins, we see that, I think it's Perez that stuck his hand out first and then retracted it, and then the other one was born first. And that is also a reference of Messiah. He came into this world very briefly, and then he left the world again. And then he's coming again. So it's the two comings of Messiah. And even that the scarlet thread that was put around Perez's hand, that speaks of the sacrifice of Messiah that came the first time, and the blood of Messiah, and that our scarlet sin will be washed white as snow. So I just wanted to tell you, this was so profound for me, just to look at this and this first and second coming of Messiah. Natanya, if you want to comment on anything, you can just pop in, but otherwise I'm going to move on. Okay, so what's interesting is when we look at this week's Torah portion, the passage itself starts off with this sentence. Here is the history of Jacob. and then it starts Joseph. So if you actually stop and if you read this like a Hebrew would read it, you would think, oh, this is weird. This doesn't make sense. Because if you start off a chapter saying this is the history of Jacob, then surely what follows should be the life of Jacob. But we see what follows after this is the life of Joseph. So there are a few explanations for this. The sages say that this is related to the northern kingdom because Jacob and Joseph are both representative of the northern kingdom. Now, if you look at the land of Israel, when they settled in it, it was later divided after the death of King Solomon into the northern and the southern kingdoms. The northern kingdoms was basically 10 of the tribes, and the southern kingdoms was the area of Judea, where Judah settled, and also a part of Benjamin, and then obviously the Levites that were scattered all over. So there were some Levites in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom. But the Jews come from the area of Judea, which is basically Judah and Benjamin. But the northern kingdom, the parts that were scattered all over the world, because of idolatry and sin, the Lord removed them. He evicted them out of the promised land. That is represented by Jacob and Joseph alike. So the northern kingdom is called Israel. It's sometimes called Ephraim. And we know that Ephraim is one of the tribes that came forth out of Joseph. Joseph was replaced by two half tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, his sons. Also in the prophets, it's known as Joseph and as Jacob. So we can see even in this, there's prophecy, where the history of Jacob is directly linked to Joseph. And this is our story because we form part of these this northern kingdom, the scattered tribes. And God is calling us back into the promised land and back into the covenant. And Joseph also represents Messiah more than any other figure in the Bible. So we can see this beautiful play on words as the Torah portion opens between the history of Jacob, Israel, and the Messiah. And this is the story of salvation. It's the Messiah coming to save all of us that were lost and scattered all over the world. So there are other things that Jacob and Joseph have in common, and that's why the rabbis say this Torah portion starts with, here is the history of Joseph. Both of them had mothers that struggled with fertility. Both had mothers who had difficult pregnancies or birth. Rebecca and Rachel both only had two sons. Remember, Rachel had Jacob and Esau. No, Rebecca had Jacob and Esau, and Rachel only had Joseph and Benjamin. Both of them were hated by their brother or their brothers. Both of them had their brothers trying to kill them, and both were shepherds. It continues with both of them being persecuted. Both were blessed with 10 blessings. Both were exiled from the promised land. They fathered children outside the promised land. Remember, the only child of Jacob's that was born inside the land was Benjamin. All of his other children were born outside of the land. And the same with Ephraim and Manasseh that were born to Joseph. They were born outside the promised land. Both had significant dreams, and both were imprisoned on account of a woman. So you may ask, but how was Jacob imprisoned? Well, he worked for 14 years for two women, and really he worked for 14 years for Rachel because that was his true love. And then poor Joseph, he was imprisoned because of Potiphar's wife. So there's a lot of similarities. Actually, the list goes on and on. I just wanted to drive home this idea that we really can't separate Jacob from Joseph. And we can't separate this story from the story of all of us, the scattered tribes and the Messiah that comes to redeem us. And then we see that Joseph gets sent by his father to go and look for his brothers. And this is also so profound because we know that Joseph is the Messiah. In the same way, God sent the Messiah to come and look for us. And we're supposed to be where the Father sent us. We're supposed to be in that area of the field where the Father said, this is where you go and pasture the sheep. But unfortunately, just like with Joseph's brothers, we tend to get bored, or we see greener grass, or we make our own ideas and we move on. And that's exactly what his brothers did. They were not where the Father sent them, and that's why he couldn't find them. And they moved on to Dothan. Now, there's a few meanings to Dothan if you look at the meaning of this name, but two that really stood out is it can mean double law, or two wells. And we know that Torah is also a well, and we should be drinking from that one well of living water. We shouldn't be mixing that well with something else. And it's so profound that when Messiah came and he was on earth the first time as Messiah ben Joseph, where did he find his brothers? He found them busy with extra laws. The Jews and the Pharisees of the day and the Sadducees, they added so many extra laws that was not what God commanded them to do. And it became a heavy burden to the people. And that's where Jesus found his brothers. That's where he found them. He found them at a place where there was extra or double, and it was not where the Father had sent them. And then the brothers plotted to kill him, and that's exactly what they did to Messiah as well. And what's interesting is that the name Judas in the New Testament is the same name as Judah. It's the exact same name in Hebrew. And we see here in this passage that it was Judah that had the idea. It actually says in the passage to profit from the sale of Joseph, and he sold him for 20 pieces of silver. And then many years later, I think it's about 1,000 years later, they sell Messiah for 30 pieces of silver. So you may ask why the difference. Wouldn't it be cool if it was the same amount? But we know that it's silver that they were sold for. And what they say is that in the time of Joseph, the price for a slave was 20 pieces of silver. But in the time of Messiah, the price for a slave was 30 pieces of silver. So maybe we can chalk this up to inflation. Okay, Natanya, would you like to share a little bit about the angel?
Yes, so as Joseph was sent by Jacob, he listened to his father speak, and his father said, I want you to go check on your brothers, see if they are well, see if the sheep are well. And then he said, Hineni, I think is the word I'm trying to remember now. He said, here I am. And he was sent, even though he knew in some part of him that his brothers don't like him and it might not be totally safe. And so he starts traveling, and he goes to the place where he was told by his father the brothers and the sheep are, or the goats are, whatever the flocks. And he reaches the place, and there's a man, and there's the sages say, Rashi is one of the sages, and he says that it has been told over from generation and generation and generation that it actually was an angel of God that told him, your brothers have moved on from here. They've moved on from this place. And so actually what the angel was trying to do is, in Joseph's heart, he was searching for brotherhood. And something that if you do listen to rabbinic advice or commentary on this specific portion, you will find that they are of the opinion that Joseph was a spoiled brat and he was tattletaling on his brothers. And Grant Luton, in this week's discussion that he does with his wife, Robin, they had this disagreement. And she said, actually, Grant convinced her that Joseph was not bratty because Joseph so represents Messiah and the life of Messiah. He says that there's just absolutely no way that he was bratty. He was eager to share and to have community and to have brotherhood. And so what the angel was trying to say to him is, you are seeking for brotherhood, but your brothers have moved on from that place. They no longer seek brotherhood with you. And so it's a warning, but that God sent an angel on the way. The sages actually said that it was the angel Gabriel. And so they removed brotherhood from their hearts. And so we see that often happens with us, and we'll get a bit later on. We're going to talk about what happens if your brothers remove brotherhood from their heart, but also what happens if you are the brother that removes brotherhood from your heart. Okay, Jacob thought when he was traveling to the land, he was looking for a place to settle and to retire. Okay, he was looking for the dust to settle in his life. And often I speak to people and they feel like, I've been fighting for years and years and years, and I no longer want to fight this battle. I just want to move into the peace of God. But we see with the story of Jacob that that's not the reality. If you are considered a tzaddik, a righteous person, your rest your benefit, your blessing will come in the next life when we pass on. If you think about, we spoke, I think we spoke last week, and we said the reward for people who walk around and pray and tell everyone they're fasting. God says there's no reward for that in the afterlife. You're getting your reward now. And so if you find yourself in a place of total peace and rest the whole time, you're getting your reward now. Blessed is the man who is suffering for righteousness' sake. And so we see the righteousness rest in the next world. And just when Jacob thought, I'm going to settle, this horrible thing with Joseph happens. But God is saying, in the next life, you will have a blessing. Okay, the second thing that we need to see here, so as Joseph is now, he met the angel, he told them that your brothers are at Shechem, and he moves down to meet them. And when he gets there, even before they saw him coming from afar, they already plotted to kill this dreamer of dreams. And Reuben then said, let's not kill him. Let's throw him in a pit. And if Reuben was truly righteous, he would have said, he would have ran to Joseph and he would have put him on his back and said, if you want to kill this boy, you're going to kill me first. I will protect you. That is the privilege of the firstborn. And the other brothers would have listened. They would have been obedient. But we see that he was a little bit preoccupied with his own sin from our previous portion with Bilhah. And he was a bit preoccupied with that. And he was trying to do everything. But the right thing would have been to save his life by giving his own life in exchange. But he didn't have that in him. And so they put Joseph in the pit. And while he was in the pit, Reuben thought, I'm going to go, I'm going to do my prayers of repentance, I'm going to come back and I'm going to save the boy from the pit. But while he's away doing his prayers of repentance for his own sin, the brothers decide, and it's actually Judah's idea, why don't we sell him? And they saw the Ishmaelites coming down. And so the Ishmaelites usually carried foul-smelling things in these caravans of theirs, and they thought, so let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And so Joseph was sold to an Ishmaelite van, and it says in the word of God that it had spices. It was a fragrant van. And so what Rashi the sage says, what we can see from this is, why did the word of God specifically say there were spices in it? And he says there's a deeper story for us here. Though what is happening to Joseph is extremely unjust. He didn't deserve, whatever he did to his brothers didn't merit them to plot his death or even to sell him into slavery. But Rashi says because God only punishes to the extent that it's necessary for his will to be done. It wasn't necessary for Joseph to be humbled and to be received into Egypt in a total humiliation. And so Joseph was taken in a van that smelled nice, and that made him smell nice. And I'm sure Joseph didn't, that was the least of his worries. But God did give that small blessing. Like sitting in the van, he didn't think, oh, at least I smell nice, but God still did it. And we see God limits our pain and suffering to be only as much as it is necessary for God to achieve his goal in the story. And so we see then Joseph is sold. He sort of, I listened to a rabbi that calls it, it's sort of like house flipping. What happened is they flipped Moses. The Ishmaelites then sold him to Midianites, who sold him to the Egyptians, and he was then sold into slavery in Potiphar's house. And Potiphar then realized, as time was going on, everything that Joseph touched, it turned to success, it turned to gold. And the stories that was told over from generation to generation is whenever Joseph was complimented, the words he would say is Baruch Hashem, blessed be God. And so he always gave praise to God. And that's why when everything started turning to gold, Potiphar himself said that God is with Joseph. And the reason for that is because Joseph kept saying, Baruch Hashem, bless God. It's him that's blessing these things. God is with me. And it became, everyone in the household knew this. And so Potiphar's wife really had a liking to Joseph. And the sages say that what happened is she went to a person who did divination, and the person said that her descendants will be linked to Joseph. And she thought that it meant that she was to have kids with Joseph, but it's not that. We see when he eventually did get out of prison, he marries her daughter. But so she was adamant. Her gods told her that she needs to have kids with this man. And so she kept on tempting him to have kids with him. And he just kept saying no. And he said, this Potiphar is good for me. I cannot do this thing. And we see something profound happening. We see Joseph being confronted with this situation over and over again, to the extent that he ran away eventually. And what happened was there was a miracle that's part of the stories that the sages tell about this portion. Is why did Joseph run away? What happened that he decided to run away? And so we see that God did a miracle for him. Why was there a miracle? Was the miracle there because Joseph had suffered? No. Was the miracle there because he had hardship? No. Was the miracle there because Joseph found himself in impossible circumstances? No. If God wanted to provide a miracle based on these three things, suffering, hardship, and impossible circumstances, he would have either taken him out of the pit or out of the van, carrying him to Egypt. But God didn't perform those miracles. So what was it? And so we see Joseph running away from Potiphar's wife. Joseph was going to give in. The story that was told over from generation to generation, that he didn't have the strength in him anymore. He was going to give in. But as he was about to give in to this extreme temptation, he saw in the window of the house a memory, an image of his father, what his father looked like. And so he saw his father Jacob in the window, and he decided to run away. And the story that was told was that the image brought up another story for him. It brought up the story of, don't forget who you are. Don't forget that you are part of the bloodline of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We do not do these things. It's an abomination to us. And if you yield to this sin, you will no longer be seen as part of this bloodline. You'll be shunned for what you've done. It's unacceptable, not only to our family, but to the God that is blessing you like this. And so the question is that this, if this really happened, right? It's just a story. And often we see these stories that were told is to drive home the idea of soul correctness. How do you help yourself in these situations? And so this, if this really happened, what is the miracle in the story? And how was the miracle brought about? And if it even was a miracle? Okay, so let's see. The first step in this miracle is why he why is he praised for this deed? Why is he praised for running away? So when someone does a good deed, a mitzvah, a positive deed from God, that he said, do not do this or do this, and he has no personal gain other than being obedient to God, it's called a very special deed. The Rambam says that it opens the door to eternity. If you can serve God and there's no ulterior motive, even if it is just on one of his commandments, it opens the door to you for eternity. The second step is, so we see that Joseph was about to give in, and the only reason he didn't do it was it's not acceptable for their God, the God that's blessing him. The second step in a miracle is, how did he get this picture, or this hologram is the word I use so that we understand, of his father in the mirror or in the window? It is because he brought something out of himself. He remembered who he is. He remembered where he came from. And so we see that in that moment, he said, remember who you are. Remember where you came from. So inside himself, he did everything that was humanly possible for him to be obedient to God. And for him, it was remembering his father, remembering where he came from. The third step in the miracle is that if you give 100% to God, then God does a miracle for you. So Joseph did everything that he could to remember why he shouldn't do this thing. And God gave him the miracle of an image of his father in the window. And so Joseph forced his Yetzer Hara out, his evil inclination. In that, put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Now you see your dad, you see Potiphar's wife, and you think to yourself, if I ever see my father again and I do this thing, will I be able to look my father in the eye and still feel part of his bloodline because of this horrible thing I'm about to do? And the shame that he felt on his evil inclination is actually the thing that made him run away. He made himself feel shameful. And when he had nothing more to give to withstand the temptation, God did the miracle of putting the image of his father there to help him and giving him an image of Jacob and reminding him of the covenant that that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we must realize that our miracles is not our solutions. We all expect God to do a miracle for us, and the miracle is that our circumstances will change, that the problem will disappear. And we see that the miracle is not your solution. It merely gives you the circumstances in which you can find a solution. And so if you are praying and your idea of praying for a miracle from God is that this problem will disappear, you are probably going to miss the miracle in the window because you're going to be looking for Potiphar's wife to be gone, and you'll miss the picture in the mirror. The miracle does not take away your problems. It provides a way through them. If you think of the people going through the Red Sea, the sea didn't disappear. It parted for them so that they can go through.
Okay, so thanks for sharing that, Nathaniel. I think that's so important, is that sometimes we expect the miracle to take away the bad stuff, but often we miss the miracles in spite of the bad circumstances. So what I want to look at, I love finding little things that you can compare to each other. I think you've seen in the last few Torah portions, we've been comparing a lot of people with people. And in this story, what I found was that there's one type of scenario in Joseph's life that kind of keeps on repeating. And what I've seen in my own life is, I call it a test. God is causing you to write a test on something, and sometimes we fail and then we have to write the test again and again and again. Sometimes we don't fail, but it's like you're leveling up, so there's something extra you need to learn about the circumstances, and there's another time it repeats and there's something extra. And I can truly testify of things that have repeated in my life, and when I'm in it I think, oh my word, why is this repeating? I thought I dealt with this the previous time. And every time afterwards, if I look back, I could see how God corrected character flaws, how I've grown, how I've changed. And eventually, when you're faced with that same circumstances or that same test, you just pass it with flying colors. And so when I looked at Joseph's story, especially the chapters that we read in this week, I just saw the same thing repeating in different ways. So I wanted to look at that because that tickled me. And part of that is to understand that if we look at this passage, it starts in chapter 37 with this whole story of Joseph being sold. And then in chapter 38, it's like when you're watching a movie and it's just getting to the good part and then there's an ad break. That's kind of what happens. Because chapter 38 seems like it doesn't fit in. In fact, go and check, if you take the last sentence of chapter 37 and you just start reading the first sentence of chapter 39, it's like the story is uninterrupted. And in between these two chapters about Joseph's life, we get this weird chapter about Judah and Tamar. And at first glance, it looks like this doesn't fit in. So I want you to just keep in mind, as we look at this, I just kept on looking at this word coat, because in every one of these chapters, we've got this thing about the coat. In chapter 37, we've got Jacob giving Joseph this coat. And there's a lot of discussion. Was it a multicolored coat, or was it a long sleeved coat? Was it a special coat? It was a special coat, that everyone agrees on. But in the Hebrew, it can be translated as a long sleeved, fine linen, silk, even coat, and not necessarily a coat of many colors. So that could be a bit of a mistranslation. But anyway, so Joseph's coat is special, and he gets one from his father. Then in chapter 38, we see this whole thing with Tamar and Judah playing off, but there's also a coat involved in that. And then in the chapter where there's Potiphar's wife, we also see a coat involved. And then when he gets taken out of prison, there's another coat. So that's how I got on this. It's all of these coats started tickling me, and I wanted to see where we're going with this. So let's compare Joseph's story and the story of Tamar first. So firstly, we can see that there's sibling rivalry in both of these stories. I deduce that there's sibling rivalry from Tamar's story because the first brother dies, he's evil and he dies. The second brother needs to do the brotherly thing, the right thing, and marry, well, not marry Tamar, but it's a specific type of marriage where he has
the Levirate marriage.
Levirate marriage, thank you. And then he needs to have a son with her, but that son will have the father that died's name, and he will be the one that inherits, okay? And then the second brother doesn't want to do that. So that tells me that there wasn't a good relationship between these two brothers. So we can see how these two stories match up. Then Tamar disguises herself, and there's this act of seduction, which immediately made me think again of, this is kind of like a bloodline repeating, because we saw that happening with Jacob, where he disguised himself and he presented himself as Esau. And then Laban also, he brings a false accusation. Laban disguises Leah as Rachel. So there's also someone that looks like someone else but isn't. So we see this thing about disguises and seduction and betrayal. And then in Joseph's story with his brothers, we have this betrayal where they betray him, but they also take his coat, and on a false accusation based on the coat, take it to the dad and say that he is he's dead. So there's also betrayal and disguise and seduction in both the stories. In Tamar's story, Judah gives her his coat. He gives her some other things as well, but remember, we're focusing on coats now. So he gives her his coat as collateral, and that was a very, that time of period thing to do. When you made a pledge to someone or you owed someone something, you would give your coat as collateral. So that was a thing of that time. It was a form of collateral. But then in Joseph's story, he gets stripped of his coat. So really, Judah got stripped of his coat as well, because Tamar kept it. She left with it. He couldn't get his coat back. But he wanted to pay with a goat. And we see that in Joseph's story, there's a goat that is slaughtered, and the blood of the goat is put on the coat. So there's a coat and goat connection here. And that, just to, as a little side note, is an amazing messianic reference, because very often with the Messiah, we don't realize that he actually fulfilled many of the sacrifices that we find. And one of the sacrifices that he also fulfilled when he died was that of the Azazel goat. So we always think of him as just the Passover lamb. But even in this, we can see that by his coat being stripped, Messiah's coat, and it being covered in blood, obviously, because he was whipped and all of the things that he went through, his coat was covered in blood. And that also signifies the coat and the goat. And the coat and the goat also takes us back to Yom Kippur, to the two goats that are sacrificed at Yom Kippur. Then Tamar challenges Judah to recognize the coat. And the word or the phrase that's used in Hebrew is the exact same phrase that the brothers asked Jacob. It's basically, do you recognize? So when Tamar was accused of harlotry and Judah said, burn her, she brought forth the coat and his staff and his signet ring, and she said, do you recognize this? And that's exactly what Jacob's sons did. They gave Joseph's coat and they said, do you recognize this? So there was this Also, thing with the disguise and the seduction and everything related to the goat. Did you want to say something, Natanya?
Yes, something interesting about Tamar and Judah, what happens here that you need to sort of delve deeper. But Tamar had the ability to publicly shame Judah and say, well, actually, the father is Judah. But she sort of threw the ball back into his court and in his hands and said, these are the things. And so she gave him an opportunity to step up and say, oh, this was me. He could have lied, so he did the right thing. But her righteous act here was the fact that she didn't shame a public figure of the area. And that was very interesting for me. And I listened to a teaching where someone took an entire hour just to speak about how we are not to shame people publicly, even if we are right. And that was a beautiful example they used of someone that had all the right in the world to publicly shame someone, and they didn't.
Yes, and the other thing that they say is that the reason that this chapter kind of is wedged in between the story of Joseph is that after the sale of Joseph, Judah felt so bad. He felt so guilty. And the brothers were so angry at him when they saw how Jacob reacted. And that's why Judah left. And he went and he lived in the area of Canaan. And he actually broke a law because it says that you're not allowed to marry a Canaanite. Later on in Deuteronomy, somewhere, it gives a whole list of the nations that you're not allowed to marry into. And the reason for that is because of their idolatry. God didn't want the idolatry to mix with the worship of God. So he just went off the rails, poor Judah. He felt so guilty. He actually went and settled in Canaan, and he married a Canaanite wife. Okay, so let's move on. When we look at Joseph in Potiphar's house versus Joseph in Jacob's house, let's see how the same thing repeats. So you're going to see the story that repeats in Joseph's life is basically this thing where his brothers betrayed him and sold him, and there's false evidence. Okay, so in Potiphar's house, it says that he oversees the whole household. But in Jacob's house, we can kind of see from the text that Joseph is second in charge. The sages say he was second in charge in Jacob's house. He was treated as a firstborn because he was the firstborn of Rachel, Jacob's great love. And we see also that all the brothers are in the field and they're working and they are shepherding the sheep. But where's Joseph? Joseph gets this amazing coat, and he's the one that just goes and oversees the brothers. He looks at what are they doing, and he comes and he reports back to the father. Potiphar's wife brings a false accusation. And also the brothers, they lie about him. There's a deception and lie in the story about the brothers because he faces this crisis brought on by members of his household. Now remember, Potiphar's wife was a member of Potiphar's household. She brings a crisis into Joseph's life. The brothers are part of Jacob's household, and she brings a crisis into Joseph's life. And both of them lie. Potiphar's wife lies, and it says she accuses him of attempted rape, and the brothers lie and they say that he's dead. Then in Potiphar's story, she strips him of his coat, and she uses the coat as false evidence against him. And that's exactly what the brothers do. They strip him of the coat and they use it as false evidence against him. And then in Potiphar's story, Joseph goes into the dungeon or the prison. And obviously when the brothers sell him, he goes into the pit. Okay, so let's just see, there's a third time that this pattern repeats, but the third time it's in reverse. So we can see the first two times it was a test. God was testing Joseph's character. He was testing his commitment. He was also giving the other people, the other players involved in the story a second chance to redo things. But when it comes to Joseph and Pharaoh, we can see there's an absolute reversal. Everything happens in reverse. It's like a mirror image. And this is God correcting everything that happened the first two times that this pattern repeated. Pharaoh has two dreams, but we know that Joseph also had two dreams. Pharaoh pulls Joseph out of the pit, but because of Joseph's dreams and the jealousy related to it and the coat that he got, his brothers throw him into the pit. When he gets pulled out of the pit, before he goes to see Pharaoh, he gets new clothes. But in the story with his brothers, he gets stripped of his coat. Then Joseph comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is an authority figure that calls Joseph to him. But in the story of the brothers, it's an authority figure, the father, that sends him away from him. And then Pharaoh has a dream, and it's like this father figure is telling the dream to a young man, and he needs that young man's help to interpret it. But in Joseph's story with his family, he's the young man, and he's telling the dream to a father figure. So we can see this absolute reversal, and even a reversal of Joseph's fate. I mean, he became second in charge of one of the most powerful nations on earth at that time. And God was in all of this, because through this, not only was the house of Israel saved during the drought, but a big part of the world was actually saved. And again, that takes us back to the messianic reference. So what is the story or the deal with this coat? Now, this was really interesting for me to see. And remember, this is just a story. It's not in scripture. This is something, like Natanya says, where from generation to generation, the story has been told over. We won't know. We'll ask Messiah when he comes. But there seems to be symbolic significance to this anyway, because of Joseph representing Messiah. So some of the sages say that what made this garment special was actually that this was the same garment that God created for Adam. When Adam and Eve sinned, they saw that they were naked, and God created a garment for them, for Adam. And this is the garment of Adam that was passed on from generation to generation. And it's this garment that Jacob gave to Joseph. Now, if we just stop here for a second, we know that Yeshua is called the second Adam, and Adam was the first Adam. And if we look in the Bible, it says that although the sin of the first Adam was, affected all of us in the form of a curse, the price, the sacrifice of the second Adam saved everyone, redeemed everyone, undid everything that the sin of the first Adam did. And if we think of Joseph mostly representing the Messiah in the Bible, I can just see all of the connections here. So I thought that was really beautiful. It says that the coat in ancient times signified leadership. And some of the sages say they're kind of split in two. Some of them say Joseph shouldn't have given Jacob the coat, and others say that it's good that he gave him the coat. So they kind of split in two. There's a lot of references that say that if Jacob had not given this coat to Joseph, that there wouldn't have been jealousy from the brothers, and the brothers wouldn't have sold Joseph. But we also know if they hadn't sold Joseph, they would have probably all died, or many of them would have died during the famine. So God is in everything. And I truly believe that it was God's will that Joseph got this coat, and that everything happened exactly the way that it happened. So Natanya, do you think Jacob was correct in giving Joseph this coat?
Yes. I think if we look at Matthew 20, Messiah speaks about what happens when the parable is that men worked in the field for the entire day, and then when they clocked up, let's say, or late in the afternoon, some people came to help in the field. They only worked 1 or 2 hours, and they all got the same wage. And it was Monty Judah that I listened to that said this, and he said, and these people were upset, and Messiah said to them, no, if someone does good, you should rejoice in it, even if the good is not for you. And we do not want Messiah to be fair, because if he's very fair, none of us would be saved, because none of us really deserve it. You cannot earn salvation. And if we had to earn salvation, I really, really think I wouldn't have made the cut, and so many other people. And so we see that, and this is what Monty Judah say, and I agree with him, that when God blesses, how many times in your life you are praying for something and praying for something and praying for something, and God gives it to every single one of your neighbors, but you are the only one praying for it. And what happens is, if you rejoice in the joy and the goodness that God is giving them, that means you are truly a brother. because you can be happy for someone else. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be a little bit sad or upset about something, but don't then go and steal that person's coat, throw them in a pit, and sell them into slavery. Don't go and say, oh, well, they've now done all of these things, but they do this, this, and this. Or in the past, when they were this age, they did this, this, and this, or they used to live this, and this life, or they used to do this, and this. And so what we do is we see a blessing on people that they might not have deserved. But clearly his brothers felt he didn't deserve the coat. He's one of the younger children. He hasn't really done anything to deserve it. And they've worked for so many years, and they are the elders. So they had a sense of entitlement, and they went and looked for what he's doing wrong. And Messiah says, no, we rejoice in goodness' sake. If someone receives something good, we are happy for them. And we do not get jealous, and we don't go and murder and shame them because we feel they don't deserve the blessing. It's not up to us to decide. It's up to God to decide who he wants to bless and who gets the blessing. And we have no right in having an opinion on it. And that I think was an absolutely amazing thing to say, because most people that you listen to feel that Jacob did wrong by blessing the son, and he didn't.
No, I also agree with you. I'm also in the other camp, the minority, that I believe that it was very godly of Jacob to give this. I believe the sin was on the brother's side for being jealous. And also, they say that if you read the passage, it says that after Joseph told Jacob and the brothers his dreams, that Jacob kept the matter in mind. And so they say that Jacob knew that there was a very special calling on Joseph's life. And I believe that's part of the mantle, because we know that a mantle also represents your authority and your calling and your office. So I believe that Jacob knew something about Joseph, and it was not really favoritism. And I believe that the sin was on the brother's side for their jealousy. Okay, so let's talk about self-reflection. Just a few ideas based on what we discussed this week. Are you running from sin and doing everything you can to avoid it? I'm sure that's something that all of us should do. But that, the fact that he didn't walk away, he didn't take his time, he ran from it. And it was a bit violent, because in the process he lost his coat. And I think if we all had that attitude of avoiding things that we know are wrong, I think it would go better with a lot of us. Do you see the small rewards of righteousness in your life, and do you thank God for it? I think that's one thing that I also try and pray for every day for myself and my husband, is that God will give us hearts that are filled with gratitude, because we've actually got so much to be grateful for. But the enemy is always changing our focus on the things that we don't have, or things that other people have that we don't have. And are you rejoicing in others' blessings, or are you jealous or envious? And I think that's an important thing, because you'll always have someone that has more, or seems like they're better off, but you don't know the price that they paid. I mean, even Joseph, if you look at the price that he paid to be second in charge, it's an immense price. So don't look at what someone else has and be envious of it, because you don't know what the price is that they paid for that. Okay, well, thanks for joining me, Natanya, and we wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom.
Please feel free to leave a comment. If you like this video, click the like button. Remember to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to ring the bell.